May 20th, 1940, German panzers reached the Channel coast at Abbeville, and in that moment, the fate of the British Expeditionary Force changed forever. Boulogne fell. Calais burned. And a steel arc began to close around hundreds of thousands of men who suddenly had one direction left to run. This is episode 12 of our long-form journey through the Second World War. If you find comfort in these quiet, long-form narratives, a like and a subscription help more than you know, and I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight. Settle in, and let's begin. The spring of 1940 moved quietly through northern France, indifferent to what was unfolding just beyond the horizon. Villages still held their morning routines. Cafe windows still fogged with warmth. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a short, lean young man named Peter Anderson drove a truck. He was a private in the 48th Division of the British Royal Army Service Corps, a branch of the military less concerned with fighting than with keeping the fighters fed, fueled and supplied. His unit worked out of a base near Arras, shuttling provisions in convoy to army units positioned closer to the front. It was, by almost any measure, unglamorous work. But in those early weeks of May, it suited Anderson fine. The war, such as it was, remained a distant abstraction. An occasional deep rumble carried through the air from somewhere far to the east, the sound of heavy guns muffled by distance into something almost geological, like a slow shifting of the earth itself. High overhead, formations of bombers crossed the sky in tight arrangements, catching the light before they dissolved into the haze. They looked, from below, like a loose scattering of insects drifting on a warm current. Nothing about them seemed urgent. Nothing seemed close. Before the war had pulled him into uniform, Anderson had been a racing car mechanic. He understood engines, tolerances, the precise language of machines under stress. Now that same understanding was applied to a brand new 3-ton truck, his truck, which he kept in careful running order as if it was something worth being proud of. His assistant driver was a Scotsman of considerable swagger, a man who had developed a habit of muttering darkly about finding a German to fight. The sentiment sounded fierce. It rarely sounded convincing. Between the two of them, they carried maps, 3 hand grenades, which made Anderson quietly uneasy, a pair of aging Lee Enfield rifles left over from the last war, and 40 rounds of ammunition. It was not the arsenal of men expecting serious trouble. Their days had settled into an almost comfortable rhythm. Convoys moved out, supplies were delivered, and the men returned to their base village in time for the evening. The square near their headquarters held a handful of cafes, and the hours after duty passed agreeably enough. Anderson and his comrades learned, in the way that resourceful soldiers always do, how to supplement their rations with whatever could be quietly acquired along the route, an arrangement that sometimes extended to the warm-hearted company of French women who had taken an accommodating view of the foreign troops passing through their villages. What none of them were told on any of those delivery runs was what the maps they carried actually meant in the broader picture. Coordinates were issued. Rendezvous points were confirmed. The trucks went east, met their counterparts from other units, unloaded and turned back. The men were given no account of the situation developing to their south and east, where the front had long since stopped holding the shape anyone had anticipated. Information travelled up the chain of command and, with rather less efficiency, remained there. Then came a night in the third week of May. The convoy, 25 trucks in all, was moving east through the darkness, its load a mixture of food and fuel. Anderson kept his eyes fixed on the blacked-out vehicle ahead of him, a pale shape barely visible at the edge of his headlamps, which had been reduced to the dimmest permissible thread of light. He was straining to hold pace, watching for the slight drift that would signal the truck ahead was slowing, when the world above him tore itself open. There was no muzzle flash, no tracers arcing across the sky. Only sound, a high, sustained shriek overhead, then another, then a rolling percussion of impacts that seemed to travel through the ground rather than through the air. The bombardment was immense. The road shuddered beneath the convoy's wheels. Anderson felt the concussion in his chest, in the very base of his teeth. The truck ahead stopped. He stopped. He held his breath, waiting for the impact from behind that seemed inevitable, and it never came. The entire convoy had frozen along the darkened road, and then the order arrived, passed from cab to cab in a low and careful chain. Cut the engines, ease the doors open, leave them open, get out and push. For the next half hour, 25 trucks were moved by hand along a French country road in the dark, with the earth still trembling around them. Men cursed in low, taut whispers. The bombardment did not let up. Slowly the convoy crept beyond reach of it, and eventually the command passed through to climb back in, turn the engines over, and carry on east. Anderson turned the thing over quietly in his mind. The guns sounded British, possibly French. What occupied him was the simpler question of what they were aimed at. Whatever lay in that direction was close. The comfortable distance he had carried between himself and the actual fighting had, without ceremony or warning, ceased to exist. The war had found him. And no one, he understood perfectly well, was going to explain any of it. There are moments in a campaign when a map stops being a map and becomes something closer to a sentence being handed down. Soldiers in the field rarely perceive those moments forming. They move through their duties, keeping pace with the vehicle ahead, taking on fuel, following coordinates toward a rendezvous, while the war's larger architecture is assembled above them without their knowledge or involvement. Private Anderson had been rolling east through the French night with no understanding of what the situation maps inside Allied headquarters were recording. Those maps, in the third week of May 1940, described a picture that no one in the lower ranks had been allowed to see. What had begun as a German armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest had done something Allied planners had considered unlikely. It had kept moving. The columns drove through the hinge of the Allied defensive line with a speed and directness that fractured any coherent response before one could form. By the 20th of May, the leading German panzer formations had pushed all the way to the northern French coast, reaching the estuary of the Somme River at Abbeville. The English Channel itself was visible from the higher ground above the town. The armoured spearheads had crossed the full width of northern France in under 2 weeks and arrived at the edge of the sea. In strategic terms, what this meant was precise and devastating. The Allied armies to the north, among them the entire British expeditionary force, had been severed from those to the south. There would be no reinforcement from below, no joining of forces. The line had been cut, and the cut was clean. From Abbeville, the panzer columns turned north. Their targets were the channel ports strung along the coastline, Boulogne, Calais, and beyond them Dunkirk. These harbours represented the only remaining means by which the armies now isolated in the north could be resupplied, reinforced, or withdrawn. Every port taken was another exit sealed. Every harbour that fell left fewer possibilities to those caught behind the advancing line. The distances involved were not large. Northern France is a compact stretch of country. A few dozen kilometres lay between one port and the next along the coast, and a comparable distance separated that coastline from the positions the BF had been holding. In peacetime, such a span meant very little, an easy morning's drive at most. In the spring of 1940, with armoured columns advancing at speeds that had confounded every established military calculation, that same stretch of ground was evaporating faster than anyone could respond to it. Boulogne was surrounded and taken on the 23rd of May. The harbour that had served as a point of entry for men and material over the preceding weeks was, within the span of a few days, in German hands. The fall of the city arrived swiftly enough to carry its own particular weight, a demonstration that the advance would grant no comfortable pause, no interval for the Allied command to reorganize and recover. One port gone, the next already under pressure. Calais held for longer. The garrison there met the assault with a dogged stubbornness that consumed days and required a serious commitment of German effort and firepower. 3 days of costly, grinding resistance, men fighting for ground they understood they could hold only for so long, doing so anyway without hesitation. When the city finally gave way, the defenders had purchased something real with everything they had. The hours they extracted from the German timetable were hours that soldiers further north would urgently need before long. While the coastal advance pressed in from the south and west, a second pressure had been growing from an entirely different direction. German forces had broken through in the northeast as well, driving toward the remaining Allied positions from the opposite angle. Belgium's army was still in the field, still engaged, still contesting the ground, but the breach that had been forced open through the line was too broad to seal. Through it, German columns were working their way toward Dunkirk from the east and southeast, completing a pincer movement that converged on the port from 2 directions at once. A trap of this kind does not announce itself through any single event. It closes by increments, each advance removing one more possibility, each fallen city narrowing the space in which those caught inside might still move. The geography of northern France, which had once offered the armies operating there any number of directions, was being reduced with patient, methodical force. The pocket was contracting. The perimeter grew tighter with each passing hour. What remained, when the narrowing had reached its limit, was a single port city on the flat, windswept coast of northern France. Dunkirk, and the panzers were still moving north. Command in wartime is a peculiar burden. The higher the rank, the more complete the picture, and the more complete the picture, the harder it can become to find within it any clear, unclouded path forward. By the 23rd of May, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force had a fuller understanding of the situation than almost anyone beneath him, and what that understanding told him was grim. General Lord Gort was a man shaped by a particular kind of soldiering, physically brave in a way that had earned him the Victoria Cross during the last war, earned it under fire without hesitation. He carried himself with the bearing of someone who had tested himself against the worst and not been found wanting. His troops had settled on a nickname for him, the Tiger. It was a tribute freely given, rooted in something genuine. His French counterparts assessed him rather differently. They found his mind methodical to a fault, better suited to the details of battalion management than to the wider strokes of strategic thinking. At a senior conference the previous November, he had opened discussion by proposing that the army settle the question of whether a helmet, when not being worn, ought to hang from the left shoulder or the right. It was not a story that circulated among his allies without a certain weary amusement. And yet, when the crisis arrived in its full severity, Gort proved to be exactly the kind of man a broken situation required. He did not spiral. He did not reach for comfortable reassurances or wait for clarity to descend from above. Where the senior French commanders found themselves staring at their maps in a state approaching paralysis, Gort kept thinking. As early as the 19th of May, 4 days before Boulogne fell, he had sent word to London raising the possibility of withdrawing the BEF to Dunkirk. The response from his superiors was firm and unambiguous. Dismiss the idea. London was still receiving reports from the French High Command that carried a tone of measured optimism, reports that described the situation as manageable, the line as recoverable. On the strength of those reports, Gort was instructed to stand his ground, to coordinate a southward attack that might cut into the German flank and restore the severed connection with the Allied armies below. Gort read those orders. He understood what they required, and quietly, steadily, he became more convinced with each passing day that following them would mean the destruction of the entire force under his command. His headquarters occupied a modest stone chateau at Premesques, not far from Lille. On the afternoon of the 23rd, he sat alone in what had once been the drawing room, a trestle table serving as his desk, the walls around him unchanged from peacetime. He had taken his breakfast that morning as he always did, hard biscuits, a scrape of marmalade, and had spoken privately to a member of his staff before settling in. What he had said that morning carried the quiet weight of a man who had already travelled some distance toward a conclusion. He confided that he had never imagined on the day he first put on a uniform that his career would lead him to preside over the greatest defeat in British military history. The afternoon passed. The room held its silence. The general sat with the maps and the orders and his own judgment, and somewhere in those hours the decision took its final shape. He would pull the BF back. He would abandon the attempt to drive south, secure a corridor of retreat, and move the army north and east toward Dunkirk, toward the Channel, and toward whatever waited beyond it. Having arrived at that conclusion, having accepted all that it meant and all that it defied, orders from London, directives from his French superiors, the entire strategic logic of the Allied command structure, Gort rose from his desk. He went for his customary evening walk. 2 miles of quiet countryside in the fading light. He returned, took a single glass of sherry, ate a spare and unremarkable dinner, and went to bed. It was the kind of stillness that only arrives after a very large thing has been settled. The decision was made. The army would head for the sea. History pivots sometimes on decisions that seem in the moment of their making entirely reasonable. The person who makes them is not acting blindly or carelessly. There is logic present, even calculation. The outcome simply does not match the intention, and the gap between what was decided and what resulted becomes the thing that historians return to, decade after decade, unable to fully explain. Such a decision was made on the 24th of May, 1940, in a modest ivy-covered townhouse in the Ardennes town of Charleville. General Heinz Guderian's armoured columns had by that point achieved something close to the extraordinary. Racing across Belgium and northern France, they had compressed weeks of anticipated advance into days. The British Expeditionary Force was cornered. The coast was near, and the leading panzers had rolled up to the edge of the Aar Canal, 30 yards wide, a modest obstacle sitting just 12 miles from Dunkirk, and halted there. By the morning of the 25th, pontoon bridges were already spanning the water. Tanks waited on the far bank, engines running, their crews ready to move. And then, from above, the order came down to stop. Adolf Hitler had made one of his characteristic unannounced visits to the headquarters of Army Group A at Charleville that day. The staff had barely enough time to clear the room before his large black Mercedes rolled up to the building. A window was thrown open to let out the tobacco smoke he found intolerable. Someone moved quickly to conceal bottles of Cointreau, another of his dislikes, before he stepped through the door. He arrived in his brown jacket and riding breeches, offered his brief salute, and moved straight to the operations map. General Gerd von Rundstedt reviewed the position of the advancing forces. The reports were extraordinary, a campaign proceeding almost beyond its own projections. And it was here, with the map spread before him, acting partly on Rundstedt's counsel, that Hitler issued the order to halt the armoured advance at the canal. Military historians have returned to this decision more often than almost any other single order of the war. The tanks that had driven the entire operation were, at that moment, within reach of an outcome that might have changed the course of the conflict entirely. One more day of advance, the right pressure applied to the right point, and the last viable exit from northern France could have been closed. The BF would have had nowhere to go. Why then did the order come? The most considered explanation points to conservation rather than miscalculation. The panzer spearheads had been moving fast and far for a long time, their flanks exposed across a great distance to the possibility of a determined Allied counterattack. Hitler had worried about those exposed flanks throughout the campaign, the thin lines of advance that looked on a map uncomfortably vulnerable. Caution of a particular kind argued for consolidating before pressing further. There was also a larger strategic picture to consider. Northern France had been taken, but all of France had not. Paris still lay to the south. The panzers would be needed again for larger battles on harder ground, and spending them recklessly against a cornered enemy in a secondary port city seemed an unnecessary risk. if some number of British soldiers managed to cross the channel before the noose fully tightened, that was a cost worth bearing. The Luftwaffe would be given the task of ensuring the numbers who escaped remained small. From a hilltop near Dunkirk, Guderian watched the rooftops of the town sitting in plain sight and said nothing useful could be done from a hilltop. He could imagine the frantic preparations already underway, the columns of men moving toward the harbour, the desperate calculations being made about ships and tides and time. He understood exactly what the halt order would allow to happen. He had been told to stop. And so, with the road to Dunkirk standing open, he stopped. The delay that followed, a day then another, was the space into which an entire army would eventually escape. An army in retreat carries its confusion openly. There is no clean line of withdrawal, no orderly peeling back of forces from a front that holds its shape. A retreat is a loosening of formations, of plans, of the ordinary assumption that someone above you knows what is happening and is managing it. The roads leading toward Dunkirk in the last days of May became a long lesson in that particular loosening. Gort's decision to pull the BEF north had been accepted by London, the approval arriving after the general had already set the movement in motion. The French High Command, however, had not entirely absorbed what was occurring. On the 28th of May, 2 full days after London had formally communicated the decision to withdraw, General Weygand's field commander, General Blanchard, had still received no word. When Gort informed him in person, Blanchard's response was one of open dismay. That he had been left in such ignorance, and that Gort in turn was dismayed to discover it, said something plainly about the state of coordination between the two Allied commands. Each man was equally astonished by the other's position. The French First Army, trapped in this communication failure, asked for another day before attempting to pull back. 24 hours. On the surface it seemed a modest request. In practice, that single day proved fatal for the unit as a whole. The army found itself encircled, caught before the withdrawal could properly begin. Its men held out with considerable courage for 3 more days before approximately half of them were forced to surrender. The remaining half did manage to fight their way through toward the coast, joining the broader stream of British soldiers and fragments of the Belgian army, all moving in the same direction. That stream was not a military formation. It was a human flood. Soldiers moved alongside the people who had lived along these roads, people who had packed whatever could be carried into carts, prams, wheelbarrows, and tied onto the backs of horses. Everything that had once been fixed, houses, routines, the ordinary geography of daily life, had become unstable overnight, and the roads absorbed all of it. One image from those roads endures with particular quietness. A boy of about 8 years old walking alongside his younger sister, pulling a small box on wheels that held the few possessions they had salvaged. A German aircraft came low over the road, its guns firing in a long, raking line along the surface. The children tumbled into the ditch at the roadside. The noise passed. The plane climbed away. Then the boy stood up. He helped his sister to her feet. He righted the wagon. He took her hand again, and they continued walking. There was nothing remarkable about this. in the sense that moments like it were occurring all along those roads, ordinary people absorbing extraordinary circumstances and then, without particular ceremony, continuing. The road did not stop moving simply because a plane had swept along it. The people on it did not stop either. They adjusted, recovered, and pressed on, because pressing on was the only direction the situation left them. The retreat was not, despite appearances, a rout. Where the machinery of military organization still functioned, it functioned with a kind of tired practicality, moving men and vehicles northwest along whatever routes remained open, establishing a narrowing perimeter, trying to hold enough ground around Dunkirk to allow the evacuation to proceed. The perimeter required men willing to stand in positions they understood would eventually be overrun, holding them anyway, buying hours for those behind them. It was unglamorous, grinding, anonymous work. Most of the men who did it are not remembered by name. The roads behind them were crowded with those who would eventually reach the sea, and many of them, soldiers and civilians both, carried with them no understanding of what awaited at the end of the road. Only that the road led north. Only that there was water at the end of it. Among the tens of thousands moving toward the coast was Private Anderson and the transport section of the 48th Division, still performing the same task they had been given from the beginning, running convoys, delivering supplies to wherever the front had most recently located itself. The routes were shorter now. There was less front to supply, and what remained of it was drawing inward by the day. Everyone in the column understood, without being told in any formal sense, what the general direction of things meant. The atmosphere of the retreat had altered something in the relationship between soldiers and the landscape they were crossing. Homes and shops stood empty along the roads, abandoned so quickly that their contents remained exactly as they had been left. Cups on tables, clothes in wardrobes, cellar doors standing open onto cool darkness, and whatever provisions had not been taken. The concept of ownership had not exactly dissolved, but it had become difficult to enforce and, in many cases, difficult to justify. People moving through a landscape that had already been lost to them took what they needed, and sometimes more. Anderson found riding boots in a shattered shop window on an empty village street, alongside 3 pairs of corduroy trousers. He took all of it. Other men in his convoy moved through the same streets with the same loose pragmatism, some collecting jewelry from abandoned counters, others gathering more practical things. One member of the unit, a clumsy fellow with a stutter that became more pronounced under pressure, had developed a particular system of his own. He collected toys from deserted houses and distributed them to the children he encountered along the roads. It was an act of such uncomplicated kindness that no one thought to comment on it. The animals came from the same impulse that gathers strays in any upheaval, a reluctance to leave living things entirely alone in a world that had become indifferent to their survival. Anderson's truck acquired 2 cats and a canary, coexisting in the cab with a wary mutual tolerance of creatures that had been given no say in the arrangement. Other vehicles in the convoy carried dogs, a sheep or 2, a goat. The animals rode among the supplies and the men, part of the informal inventory of the retreat. The farmhouse discovery came unexpectedly. A cellar that had been overlooked in the general clearing out held cheese and cream and bread and wine in considerable quantities. Anderson and his companions moved a table out to the roadside and spent time distributing what they had found to the column of people moving past. Chamber pots pressed into service for the cream, jugs of cheese passed from hand to hand, loaves of bread broken off and handed over. The wine they kept. It went into the trucks for later. What the roads gave freely in those days was fear, and that required no foraging. The strafing runs came with increasing frequency, aircraft dropping out of the sky in shallow, shrieking dives, stitching the road surface with rounds before pulling up and banking hard to come back along the same line from the opposite direction. Anderson and the others would throw themselves into the ditches and lie still, listening to the sound travel away, watching the vehicles on the road to see which ones had been hit, which had caught fire, which were still intact. Burned vehicles appeared along the route with growing regularity, hulks sitting in the roadside grass, some of them still carrying their dead, figures blackened and still in seats or half collapsed through open doors. The smell reached the convoy before the wreckage came into view, a combination of scorched rubber, melted wiring, and something worse underneath it that no description quite captures, and that no one who has encountered it forgets. Then came guard duty. In a night bivouac, Anderson was posted with a Bren gun, a weapon he had never made his peace with, heavier and more consequential than anything his mechanics background had prepared him for. He stood in the darkness trying to interpret the sounds and shapes of the countryside around him, unsure which frightened him more, the thing he could not see beyond the hedge line, or the gun resting in his hands. It was becoming a different kind of war. The pleasant distance of the early weeks had burned away entirely. What remained was just the darkness, the weapon, and the waiting. Something moved along the hedge line to his left. Anderson had been standing at his post for long enough that his eyes had adjusted to the darkness, though adjustment in this landscape meant little more than the ability to distinguish between different depths of shadow. The fields and hedgerows of northern France at night resolved themselves into a limited vocabulary of shapes, none of them reliable. He watched the movement. It stopped. Then, a moment later, it came again, a shifting in the shadows, close enough to the post to demand a response. His training offered him a clear protocol for this situation. Call out, identify yourself, challenge the unknown presence through established procedure. It was the correct thing to do. Anderson did not do it. Something in his body moved ahead of the protocol, some combination of exhaustion and apprehension, collapsing the distance between stimulus and action. He shouldered the gun. He placed his finger on the trigger and pressed it with the intention of a single warning shot. A sharp report, nothing more, something to announce that the post was occupied and its occupant was armed. What he had forgotten in the darkness and the tension of the moment was that the Bren gun he was holding had been set for burst fire. The gun discharged in a long, shattering staccato that tore open the quiet of the bivouac. The burst raked the hedge line with thorough, mechanical efficiency. In the half-second following the shots, the camp erupted. Men jolted out of sleep, boots hitting the ground, voices cutting through the darkness in various registers of alarm. Bodies ran in several directions at once, operating entirely on instinct, seeking cover from an attack whose nature and origin no one had yet established. The noise of running feet and urgent voices filled the air around Anderson, while the smoke of the discharge still hung around the muzzle of the Bren. Then the cries coming from the hedge resolved themselves into something recognizable. The movement in the shadows had been a cow. The sustained burst had found it with considerable thoroughness. The animal was, by any assessment, no longer a military concern. The senior officer responsible for Anderson's unit heard the report with the resigned expression of a man whose long-held assessment of a subordinate had just received fresh confirmation. He repeated, in Anderson's presence, a view he had apparently carried for some time, that Anderson would never, under any foreseeable circumstances, make a satisfactory soldier. The reprimand was delivered without particular energy, which suggested the major had also already calculated the secondary situation that had developed, that Anderson had inadvertently provided the unit with a significant quantity of fresh beef. The stakes were substantial. There were enough to feed the men of Anderson's unit through a proper meal, and enough beyond that to share with the soldiers from other units who were passing through on the road toward Dunkirk, men in various states of exhaustion and disarray, moving with the particular focused quiet of people who have reduced their expectations to the simplest possible terms. The food was handed over without ceremony. A few kind words went with it. Someone offered the assurance, stated with more confidence than anyone actually possessed, that ships would be waiting when they reached the coast. Whether those words were believed is impossible to say. The men took the food, nodded their thanks, and moved on. The road stretched out ahead of them, still dark, still moving, carrying its quiet load of tired and uncertain people toward the water. Anderson watched them go. He was not a soldier by instinct or inclination. He was a mechanic who had found himself holding a military weapon in a foreign country at night, and he had just destroyed a cow by accident. The war, whatever else it was, had long since stopped resembling anything he might have imagined it to be. He put out his hand for a steak. He had earned at least that much. Across the channel, England had been listening. The sound of it came at night, the low thrum of engines drifting in from the water, carrying through bedroom windows and across harbour walls, and into the awareness of anyone who lived close enough to the coast to catch it. Those who heard it in the last days of May 1940 understood well enough what it meant. The news from France had been arriving in fragments for weeks, each fragment darker than the one before, and the atmosphere along the English coastal towns had thickened with a particular kind of quiet dread. The boats moving in the darkness were part of something large that was already in motion. The Royal Navy had begun its planning on the 20th of May, the same day the German panzers reached Abbeville and the Allied pocket in the north was sealed. The operation was given a name, Dynamo, and the scale of what it would require was immediately apparent. No one could say with certainty how many men would manage to reach the coast, or in what condition, or how much time the perimeter would hold. What was certain was that retrieving them would demand every vessel that could move under its own power and cross open water. Destroyers were the natural first choice. They were fast, well armed against aircraft, and capable of running multiple crossings in a single day. Of the 200 destroyers and escort vessels in the British fleet, 41 were available. The rest were committed elsewhere, undergoing repairs or already lost. 41 would have to be enough, and they would have to be supplemented by everything else that could be found. The requisitioning reached down through every category of vessel that the English coast and its rivers had to offer. Personnel ships and cross-channel ferries were called in. Fishing trawlers came. Ancient paddle-wheel steamers, their working lives long past the point where anyone had expected much of them, were pressed back into service. Thames River barges with enormous canvas sails, fireboats, coastal craft of every description, all of it was gathered into the operation. French, Belgian and Dutch vessels came as well, their crews joining the effort without hesitation. And then there were the private owners. The call had gone out to the yacht clubs along the coast, and the response it produced was not what might have been predicted from a purely practical calculation. Yachtsmen arrived from considerable distances, some surrendering their boats to naval crews, many others refusing to relinquish them at all, and insisting on making the crossing themselves. These were not, for the most part, military men. They were weekend sailors, retired professionals, middle-aged men who had kept their boats as a private pleasure and now found, without entirely planning for it, that the boats were needed for something else. The requisition of the motor vessel B at Portsmouth produced one such exchange. Her engineer, Fred Reynard, had tended her Swedish-built engines since 1912 and declined to step away when the Navy came for the boat. Called before Admiral Sir William James to explain himself, Reynard's position was simple. The Navy's young officers did not know these engines. He did. The Admiral noted carefully that there was no guarantee of return, that shell fire was a reasonable expectation, and that the crossing offered no comfort to those who made it. Reynard straightened. He asked by way of answer whether the Admiral had heard of Gallipoli. The Admiral had. Reynard sailed with the B. In every harbour and estuary and tidal inlet along the coast, boats were being crewed and readied. The variety of what was assembling had no precedent in any naval record. A fleet defined entirely by its improbability, drawn together not by doctrine or strategy, but by geography and urgency and the particular willingness of ordinary people to move towards something terrible because the need was plain. The fleet that would cross the Channel for Dunkirk was unlike any fleet that had sailed before it, or would sail again. When the Armada departed on the 26th of May, what it looked like was almost beyond description, and what it felt like to those watching from the docks was something that drew the breath out of a person and replaced it with something harder to name. The quays at Dover were stacked 3 deep with vessels of every possible type, motor launches resting against sloops, resting against fishing boats. Folkestone and Margate and Ramsgate and Portsmouth had their own crowds of departing craft, each one distinct, each one adding its note to a general spectacle that the eye struggled to organize into any coherent category. The fleet that moved out across the Channel that day was not a naval formation in any recognizable sense. It was a gathering, the accumulated response of a coastline to a disaster it had decided, in various private ways, to meet. Among the vessels that made the crossing, a river gunboat named the Mosquito, which had last seen service on the Yangtze, a Thames barge called Galleon's Reach with its heavy sails, the cross-channel ferry Canterbury, a small island ferry that had spent its working life in gentle island waters, christened Gracie Fields, a motor launch named Count Dracula, a boat with its own strange history, once belonging to a German naval officer, scuttled at Scapa Flow when the German fleet surrendered in 1919 and later raised and returned to service. Tom Sopwith's sailing yacht Endeavour, which had challenged for the America's Cup, and a century-old open sailboat named simply Dumpling, which had no obvious business being on the open channel at all. The skippers were as improbable as their vessels. Commander C. H. Lightoller had survived one famous maritime disaster already. He had been the senior officer to escape the Titanic, and now he was heading across the channel in his 60-foot private yacht Sundowner with his son and a Sea Scout for crew, navigating from charts he acknowledged were out of date. The Honourable Lionel Lambert had armed his yacht for the crossing and seen fit to bring along his personal chef. The Earl of Craven was serving as a third engineer on a harbour tug. Captain Jones, known along the coast as Potato Jones, a nickname that bore no relation whatsoever to the toughness of the man, had in his recent history run blockades during the Spanish Civil War and wore a ring in his ear as if daring anyone to misread him. The channel that waited for them was its own particular obstacle. The coastal buoys and lightships had been blacked out. The water was heavily mined, and the Navy had swept only 3 narrow corridors through the fields to the French coast, corridors that every vessel would need to use, queuing through the swept channels while the exposed flanks on either side remained dangerous. German artillery had already been moved into position along the shoreline near Calais, its range reaching far across the water. Shells were falling in the channel. Dive bombers ranged across the approach routes. The narrow shallows off the Dunkirk coast presented their own problem. The water was thin, the sandbanks extensive, and there was no room for the kind of evasive movements that a skipper might attempt in open water to avoid a falling bomb. The boats crept in along fixed approaches, and those who pushed their speed too high in an attempt to minimize their exposure paid for it on the sandbars. Their stranded hulls added to the hazard for the vessels that followed. And still they came. The thrum of engines, the snap of sails in the channel wind, the deep churning of paddle wheels, the sounds of the fleet moving out across the grey water toward a coast where the smoke was already visible, rising in a dark column that could be seen from England on a clear morning. It was both a beacon and a warning, and the skippers heading toward it understood both things perfectly. Most of them went anyway. There is something in that decision that resists easy explanation. It was not naive. These were people who understood with reasonable clarity what they were crossing toward. The smoke told them. The shell fire on the water told them. And yet the boats went on, their wakes crossing and recrossing the channel surface, carrying with them a stubbornness that was not quite heroism and not quite ordinary either. Something in between, something that belonged specifically to that particular stretch of water at that particular moment in time. It rose from the oil storage tanks at the edge of Dunkirk in a column so massive and so dark that it altered the colour of the sky above the French coast, turning the daylight in that quarter of the horizon a bruised and oily brown. The tanks had been hit by Stuka dive bombers and the artillery firing from positions around the perimeter, and they had been burning for days. The fire had taken on a quality of permanence, as if it had settled in and decided to outlast the situation that had started it. Inside Dunkirk, the fire was everywhere. The harbour district had taken sustained bombardment, and the buildings that had once defined it were largely gone, collapsed or still burning, or reduced to a rubble that made the streets difficult to distinguish from the spaces between them. The smell of smoke was absolute. It settled on clothing and skin and into the lungs of anyone who moved through the city, and it did not leave. The men filing through the streets toward the harbour carried it with them onto the boats and across the channel and home. What no one had anticipated when the tanks first ignited was that the fire would serve as something more than a marker of destruction. By day, the rising columns of heavy black smoke spread into a low ceiling across the harbour and the approaches to it. Waves of dive bombers arrived over the city and found themselves unable to locate targets with any precision through the murk. Formation after formation turned back toward its bases without dropping a significant load. The smoke that signaled catastrophe was simultaneously providing a kind of accidental cover, obscuring the harbour and the mole and the beaches from the aircraft that had come to destroy whatever the guns had not already managed. Hundreds of men who boarded ships during those smoke-covered daylight hours owed their lives, in some measure, to burning oil. After dark, the relationship reversed itself entirely. The fires that had screened the evacuation by day now illuminated it by night. The harbour entrance, which might otherwise have been impossible to navigate in blackout conditions, was lit by the surrounding flames in a shifting amber glow that showed the breakwaters and the remaining usable quays well enough for approaching vessels to find their way in. The skippers who came in under darkness did so with the fires as their guide, an eerie and unreliable light, but sufficient for the work required. The harbour itself had been reduced, in terms of useful infrastructure, to almost nothing. The civilian docks, the warehouses, the proper berthing facilities that a working port required, all of it was wrecked. What remained as the primary loading point was one of the two breakwaters enclosing the harbour, a construction that had been built for an entirely different purpose. This was the East Mole, 2/3 of a mile in length, made of rock faced with timber pilings, its surface covered with boardwalk wide enough for men to pass 3 abreast. Along its edges ran a timber railing, the only thing between a man walking its length and the water churning below. It had been designed to manage wave action. It was now the primary means of boarding several 100,000 people onto ships. The tides complicated everything. The channel tides ran 15 feet between high and low, and at high water the vessels pulled alongside the mole sat at roughly deck height with its surface. Men could step across makeshift spans and walk aboard. At low tide the drop was considerable, and men had to jump. One ship's carpenter constructed boarding spans from the wooden frames of water polo goalposts, lashing them into something that would serve. It was that kind of improvisation, repeated in 100 different forms across every part of the operation, that kept it moving. The fires burned through all of it. Day and night the smoke rose and the glow pulsed, and the ships came in and went out again, and the line of men on the mole shuffled forward with the particular patience of people who have run out of alternatives. The city burned around them. The harbour burned ahead of them, and the boats kept coming through the fire and the smoke as if ordinary darkness had simply been replaced by something worse, and the work continued regardless. From the deck of an approaching vessel, the sight of the mole was not easily forgotten. A line of men stretched the full length of the 2/3 of a mile structure, then continued back along the beach behind it in a single unbroken mass that bent and curved with the shoreline until it disappeared. Thousands of figures stood in close order on the timber walkway, their faces carrying the particular blankness that arrives when exhaustion has been sustained long enough to move through all its earlier stages, the agitation, the fear, the restless energy, and arrived at something more fundamental on the other side. They stood. They waited. They shuffled forward when the line moved. When the planes came, they lay flat on the boards and watched the rounds come toward them across the harbour surface. Then they stood up again and waited. A man lying flat on the mole during an air attack had no cover available to him. The railing was timber. The surface beneath him was timber. The water on both sides offered nothing useful. The only option was to press against the boards and hold still while the noise came and went, and hope that the mathematics of the raid worked out in his favour. One soldier described the sound of bullets hitting the harbour surface as crackling fat in a very large pan. It is the kind of description that arrives only after the mind has found a way to hold the experience at a slight remove, to place it in the familiar vocabulary of the kitchen, the ordinary, the domestic, because the alternative vocabulary offers no comfort at all. The ships that came alongside the mole operated in their own particular atmosphere of compressed risk. The paddle wheel steamer Fenella had taken on 600 troops and was lying at the mole when a bomb found her. The impact was direct. Many of the men below died immediately. A second bomb struck the jetty itself, sending fragments of concrete and rock through the hull beneath the waterline. The engine room flooded. Those who had survived on the Fenella were moved off her stern in whatever order could be managed, some walking, some on stretchers, some carried by others, while aircraft made passes overhead. Most of them reached the paddle steamer Crested Eagle, which was lying alongside the jetty. It was a transfer conducted under fire, and the majority of the men made it across. Meanwhile, the destroyer Grenade, also at the mole, had caught fire. Her mooring lines burned through and she began drifting uncontrolled across the harbour entrance, a burning, unmanned ship blocking the single channel through which all the other vessels needed to pass. A trawler moved out into the harbour, came alongside the destroyer despite the flames and the secondary explosions, got a line onto her, and towed the burning hulk clear. The entrance was reopened. The next vessels came through. The Crested Eagle, having taken on survivors from the Fenella, then took a direct hit from a dive bomber. She caught fire and drifted onto the beach. The majority of the troops aboard her did not survive. And then, among all of this, Commander Lightoller brought his 60-foot yacht Sundowner in alongside a destroyer at the mole and began loading men. He sent them below, instructing them to lie down to distribute the weight. When 50 men had come aboard, he called down to his son and asked how it was looking. "Plenty of room yet," his son said. At 75, his son admitted it was getting close. The men kept coming. Lightoller told the next ones to go forward on deck and lie flat. When 50 were on deck, he could feel the boat growing unsteady in the water, tender, a sailor would say. meaning a vessel beginning to answer poorly to her own weight. He had by then loaded 130 men onto a 60-foot pleasure craft. He ran for England. When the Sundowner docked at Ramsgate, the boat rolled sharply as all those men rose to their feet at once. She righted. The men came ashore in a long, unlikely stream, and a harbour worker who helped them off the gangway looked at the boat, looked at the men, and shook his head slowly. "God's truth," he said. "Where did you put them?" "Wine expect." North and south of Dunkirk, beyond the harbour and its burning infrastructure, the beaches extended in long, pale arcs. Malo-les-Bains, Bray Dunes, La Panne to the north, Mardac to the south. Here the evacuation operated at a different register, slower and more exposed, and in some ways more strange. The sounds of the city carried on the wind, distant enough to have a slightly unreal quality, like something happening in a different version of the same situation. The men on these beaches waited in the same long-shaped lines as those on the mole, with the same exhausted patience. Sapper Thomas Morley, coming over the dunes toward the beach at Bray on the evening of the 29th of May, stopped when he reached the crest and saw what lay below. Spread across the sand as far as the eye could follow were small points of light, thousands of them, a field of tiny glows moving gently in the evening air. Walking down toward the beach, he realized each point of light was a cigarette, held by a man sitting in the sand waiting in his queue for the line to inch forward. It is an image worth sitting with. Thousands of men in the last hours before whatever came next, smoking quietly in the dark. The difficulty of the beach evacuation was geometric. The channel tides here uncovered half a mile of sand at low water, and the shore gradient was so gradual that even the shallowest draft vessels had to hold hundreds of yards offshore. The men who needed to board them had to get from the sand to the ships, and there was nothing between the two except open water. Many waded out to their waists, their chests, their shoulders, still carrying their equipment, finding that the weight of wet wool and leather and kit became treacherous past a certain depth. Some went under. Most did not, but the ones who did were remembered by those who watched. The smaller vessels, coasters, lifeboats, private yachts, came in as close as they dared and took on men directly from the water. Some units tried to improvise landing stages from the frames of abandoned trucks, lashing wreckage and driftwood together to extend the reach into shallower water. The attempts were variable in their success. The channel swell undermined most structures faster than they could be reinforced. One solution arrived through a different kind of thinking entirely. On the 29th of May, Lieutenant E. L. Davies brought his paddle minesweeper Oriole into the beach north of Dunkirk and simply drove her in. He ordered his crew aft to raise the bow as high as possible, dropped 2 anchors astern, and put her at 12 knots directly at the beach. The Oriole grounded firmly bow high and became a bridge. Men waded out through the surf and climbed her hull to her stern, where other vessels waited in deeper water to take them off. Nearly 3,000 troops used the beached Oriole as a pier before the tide came in sufficiently to float her again. That night, the crew hauled on the anchor lines and worked her off the sandbar. She returned to England carrying 700 soldiers and a contingent of nurses from a field hospital. Ships that had brought collapsible boats deployed them into the surf, and soldiers paddled toward the waiting vessels using rifle butts as oars and helmets as bailers. The boats capsized in the shallower breakers with some frequency, and not all of those who went into the water came back up. More than 700 men had boarded the paddle minesweeper Gracie Fields when a dive bomber hit her. The explosion ruptured her engine room pipes and jammed her rudder, and the Gracie Fields began turning in a tight circle at 6 knots, unable to stop. 2 tugs and another minesweeper came alongside and circled with her, matching her movement, while they took off the survivors. The water off those beaches held, by the end of the evacuation, the debris of every kind of improvised attempt to bridge the distance between shore and ship. Empty boats, floating timber, abandoned equipment, oil spreading in slow, iridescent circles from the wrecks that had accumulated across the approaches. The oil coated the sand and the men who waded through it, and it made the rescue work slippery and slow. But the work continued. The lines on the beach shuffled forward, and eventually, for most of them, a boat arrived. By the time the evacuation had been running for several days, those managing it had confronted an accumulation of the unexpected, the mechanical, the logistical, the human. One category of the unexpected was the animals. The British soldiers who had moved through the villages and farmhouses of northern France had gathered creatures along the way with a consistency that spoke to something particular about the national character. Dogs and cats and other animals had ridden in trucks, slept in bivouacs, and followed their adopted units through the retreat with an apparent willingness that their owners found encouraging. The beaches presented the question of what came next. Most of the ship's commanders imposed a clear prohibition. Animals would not be permitted aboard. The practicalities of loading thousands of men in difficult conditions under periodic air attack allowed for no accommodation of the additional complication. For the soldiers who had carried their animals through the retreat, this produced a final private reckoning. Some turned their pets loose, choosing to believe, or at least to hope, that an animal released into French countryside might find its own way forward. Others, concluding that abandonment meant starvation or worse, used their last remaining ammunition to ensure a kinder end. Captain Edward Bloom had adopted a large sled dog he called Hugo. He took the dog behind one of the dunes, spoke to him quietly for a few minutes in a low and soothing voice, and then did what he had decided had to be done. The beach continued around him. The lines moved. The dogs were not mentioned again. The ship Killarney, a personnel vessel whose decks were crowded with soldiers, came under fire from German shore batteries during the crossing. For the better part of an hour, Captain Hughes attempted to maintain headway while maneuvering in the narrow swept channels between the minefields, and in that time one direct hit struck the stern, killing 8 men and wounding 30 more. When the artillery finally fell behind them and the immediate danger from the batteries receded, a dive bomber arrived to reopen the account. A British Spitfire appeared and drove it off. The Killarney continued. Then the watch spotted something floating, a raft assembled from a door and scrap lumber, carrying 3 Belgians and a Frenchman. The 4 men had with them 2 tins of biscuits, 6 large containers of wine, and a bicycle. The Killarney hove to and brought them aboard. The final French evacuation, conducted on the night of the 3rd of June, carried its own particular texture. The rear guard on the perimeter had held longer and fought harder than anyone had projected, and when the Royal Navy sent its crews back for one more sweep, they brought off more than 26,000 French soldiers. The operation was complicated by the difficulty of language. Instructions that needed to be precise and immediate in the surf were not always comprehensible across the gap between English-speaking sailors and French-speaking soldiers. Lifeboats that could safely take men only one at a time were sometimes rushed by too many at once and capsized. Some French soldiers watching this refused to enter the water at all. One French officer remained seated on the beach with considerable composure while a rescue yacht sent a man in to retrieve him. The officer sent back a note instead of coming himself. The skipper read it and translated. The message explained with an apparent seriousness that made its absurdity complete that the officer had recently eaten and on that account was unable to enter the water at the present time. He was presumably eventually collected by other means. In the final hours, the ordinary rules of sense and solemnity had worn thin enough that moments like this one could occur alongside genuine horror and genuine courage, all of it happening at once on the same stretch of sand in the smoke-filtered light of a city that had been burning for days. On the 4th of June, Private Anderson made his final delivery run. He had been driving supply convoys since the first days of the campaign, and this last one carried food from the outskirts of Dunkirk to the remaining troops still assembled at the city's edge. It was by any measure a short route. The perimeter had contracted to a fraction of what it had been, but the delivery was made, and the supplies were handed over, and then the orders Anderson received for the last time were simple. Take the truck as far as Bray Dunes. Distribute whatever remains to any soldiers still arriving. When the supplies are gone, destroy the vehicle and make for the beach. He drove to Bray Dunes, fed the last of what he was carrying to the men still moving through, and then did what he had been told. He stripped the gearbox and put the engine out of any useful service. He left his rifle in the cab, a decision he recorded without apparent regret, and his tin helmet, which had never fitted him properly in any case, alongside it. The standard issue boots came off too. He replaced the army breeches with the corduroy trousers he had found in that shattered shop window some days earlier, pulled on the riding boots from the same find, and settled a spare forage cap on his head. Into his pack went his remaining treasures, the 2 extra pairs of corduroy trousers among them. Then he strolled down through the dunes to the beach. The scene he found there had a quality of suspended ordinariness that he found unexpectedly calming. Lines of men stood and sat across the sand, the destroyers running back and forth offshore in a pattern that reminded Anderson of officers pacing a corridor. Smaller vessels lay at anchor further in, their lifeboats making repeated trips between the ships and the shore. The sand was white and fine. The weather was pleasant, the sky mild, the surf gentle. The smoke of Dunkirk drifted in a dark mass to the southwest, but here, for the moment, the air was clear enough. Anderson walked and looked around him, in no great hurry to join one of the lines. Some of the men in the waiting queues had apparently taken him for an officer, the riding boots and cord trousers conferring an authority that his rank had never provided. He found this quietly amusing. Then a voice called his name. Behind a dune sat a group from base supply he recognized well. Green, a large and jovial fellow who wore his size with good humor. A diminutive sergeant known as Rabbit for reasons connected to his eating habits. A corporal called Gill who rarely troubled to remove his pipe and whose false teeth had a documented tendency to depart when he did. With them were a couple of men Anderson did not know. The group had established a workable arrangement. Each member had contributed a water bottle filled with spirits, and Anderson was welcome to join provided he supplied his own. The source, they explained, was a restaurant just along the beach that had been largely emptied out, save for a few bottles of Cointreau left on a shelf. Anderson retrieved the Cointreau, filled his canteen, and rejoined the group. The afternoon passed with a degree of mellow conviviality that sat oddly against everything around it, and yet seemed, in that particular moment, entirely natural. The perimeter was contracting. The last of the army was moving toward the water. But the beach behind the dune was warm, and the Cointreau was sweet, and the men talked in the easy way of people who have been through enough together that silence and conversation have become roughly equivalent. Then morning came, and with it the planes. The Stukas and Messerschmitts swept in over the beach in waves, scattering the men waiting in their queues, sending them flat on the sand and running for the sparse cover the dunes provided. Offshore, the destroyers threw themselves into evasive maneuvers, their guns firing back at the aircraft overhead. Anderson watched a plane hold its dive over a destroyer for what seemed like too long, and then there was a concussive white flash and the sea closed over the space where the ship had been. A second destroyer took a hit astern. It settled backward into the water and was gone within minutes. Between the attacks, the men reformed their lines, shook the sand from themselves, and stood again in patient order. At one point, 6 aircraft swept low over the beach and the men scattered, then looked up to see the RAF roundels on the wings and began cheering and waving. The planes made a tight turn, came back along the same line and opened fire. They had been captured aircraft flown by German pilots. The men hit the sand again. Later that afternoon, a hospital ship rode at anchor offshore, her red crosses clearly marked on the hull. She survived several attacks. Then a bomb found her funnel. Anderson thought for a moment it had not detonated, and then the upper decks came apart. The ship erupted in flame. What looked from the shore like a mass of small figures poured over the sides into the water. By dusk, the bodies were reaching the beach on the tide. The men standing nearby placed their coats and ground sheets over them and left them where they lay. Through the night, the burning ship continued to light the water, and the covered shapes on the sand, seen from a distance, looked to Anderson like pale creatures cast up from the sea. Dawn came on the 5th of June to a beach that still held men and almost no boats. The rescue vessels had withdrawn overnight. The men remaining on the sand understood, without anyone needing to say it plainly, that their position had become considerably less certain. There was chocolate, barely edible, already softened by the warmth, and there was the open beach, and there was the question of what the next hours would bring. Anderson and his group from base supply settled down to wait with the patience that by now had become their principal tool. A captain among them had noticed something offshore, a ship's lifeboat, stranded on a sandbar just beyond the breakers. He organized a small group to retrieve it, and Anderson's companions asked to join. They waded out and worked the heavy boat free of the sand, brought it back through the surf, bailed it, checked it over, and pulled it up onto the beach above the tide line. It was large enough to carry perhaps 40 men. They prepared it as well as they could and then retired to the dunes to wait for darkness before attempting to use it. Late that afternoon, a shout went through the men still on the beach. A large paddle steamer had appeared offshore and was holding position directly off their section of the sand. Anderson's group moved without discussion. They had the lifeboat, and now there was something to row toward. They pushed it back into the water and climbed in, working the oars toward the waiting ship. Anderson had one difficulty: his pack. It carried his accumulated treasures from the retreat, including the 2 extra pairs of corduroy trousers that had survived the entire journey from that deserted shop window. He held onto them as long as he reasonably could, and then jettisoned the pack and pulled himself into the last available space in the boat. The lifeboat pulled alongside the paddle steamer, and Anderson climbed a rope netting up to her deck, pausing once to watch his friend Green making the same climb below him, large, red-faced, eyes very wide, lungs working at considerable effort, hands gripping the net with total conviction. He made it. The lifeboat went back and forth between the ship and the beach until both were empty. The steamer was the Margate Belle, a paddle steamer that had spent her ordinary working life on peacetime channel crossings, ferrying day trippers and holiday makers, and was now loading the last men from the last section of the last beach. Her paddles churned the sea as she turned for England, and Anderson went below and slept. He did not wake until she was coming into her berth at Margate, the same berth she had used on her regular sailings before any of this had happened, and the motion of docking had brought him back to something resembling consciousness. On the continent, the last of the rearguard had already gone. The final staff officers had come off the mole at 2 in the morning on the 4th of June, and later that same day German forces had entered Dunkirk. On the jetty they found what the evacuation's last hours had left behind: French troops who had not made it off, standing in long columns as the German soldiers moved through to process them as prisoners. The work was slow. Near the end of the mole, a French naval doctor had looked out at the water and noticed a lifeboat still aboard a ship that had settled, damaged, directly in front of him. He gathered 12 volunteers from the men around him. They jumped across to the vessel, got to the lifeboat, and found that its propulsion was a pedal-driven mechanism. They began pedaling. German machine guns opened up on them from the shore. They pedaled harder, staying low, until the distance and the angle of fire made it impractical for the guns to pursue them. Once out of range, they assembled a makeshift sail from a blanket, caught the wind, and pointed toward England. Hours later, a naval vessel found them at sea and brought them in. That doctor and his 12 companions were the last of the 338,226 soldiers, British, French, Belgian, Dutch, to leave the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk. The number is precise because it was counted carefully by people who understood that every single figure within it represented something that had come very close to being lost. The operation had lasted 9 days. The fleet that achieved it had included everything from fleet destroyers to open sailboats, held together by a common purpose and the particular stubbornness of people who had decided that the thing needed doing and that someone present would have to do it. Anderson slept all the way across the channel in the hold of the Margate Belle and woke in the place he had started from, in a country that was still standing, on a morning that had come anyway. He had lost his pack. He had lost the corduroy trousers. Some things, in the end, simply get left behind.